Hello again. I'm back for this week's book, and I actually had plenty of time to work on the script. It only took me 2 days to actually read the book. It helped that I'd read it before, and the way that the book is written makes for pretty easy reading. Anyways, this week's book is Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. It's one of my favorite books of all time, but before I get into it, there are two things that I wanted to mention real fast. First is in the video on the chalice and the blade, I think I said two things. I think I said that I don't remember where I heard about the chalice and the blade, and two, that it reminded me a lot of Ishmael, and that I think Ishmael got a lot of its inspiration from the chalice and the blade. Well, it turns out that the chalice and the blade is directly mentioned in Ishmael, and I'd completely forgotten. So Ishmael is where I heard about the chalice and the blade, and yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that it got a lot of inspiration from the chalice and the blade. The other thing is, speaking of the chalice and the blade, I feel really bad about how that video went. I think that's a really good book, and it deserves a lot more effort to be put into it. So I'm going to spend some time working on redoing that video. I don't know when I'm going to get to that, but I think it's important that I do. All right, with that out of the way, let's dive on into Ishmael. So whenever I tell people what Ishmael is about, I just say it's about a gorilla teaching a guy how to live. A bit of an oversimplification, but that's basically what the book is at its core. If you've never heard or read this book before, I'll give a quick synopsis, but I'll quickly say here that I'm gonna spoil every conclusion that the book comes to. So just a forewarning, it's a really good book, definitely worth the read, and I think it does the journey of discovery a little bit better. So I would say read it, and then if you want, come back. Anyway, so brief synopsis of the book. There's this guy who felt like he needed a teacher to teach him how to live and to save the world. And he spends a lot of time looking for this teacher, but he eventually gives up because he decides, or learns, I guess, that this teacher doesn't exist, and even the knowledge itself that he wants to learn doesn't exist either. So he gives up, and this leaves him a little bit bitter. Then one day he sees an ad in the newspaper that says, "Teacher seeks pupil, must have an earnest desire to save the world, apply in person." This makes him really mad, and he explains why. But he has to go and meet the teacher to set himself at ease, to see what kind of a scam artist is putting something out like that. When he gets to the location listed in the ad, he is very surprised to find a gorilla in the place, and even more surprised that the gorilla is in fact the teacher. The gorilla, who we come to find is named Ishmael, gives his whole backstory about how he came to be there and how he came to be able to communicate. I think the beginning is probably the weakest part of the book, but it's very necessary. It would be kind of difficult to just be thrown in and be like, why is there a gorilla talking to a dude? Doesn't really make a lot of sense, but yeah, so the backstory is pretty important. Then the meat of the book really starts through a series of lectures or more dialogues between Ishmael and this unnamed guy. So then the meat of the book really starts. We learn everything through a series of lectures, or rather dialogues between Ishmael and this unnamed guy. My personal headcanon is that the unnamed guy is Daniel Quinn, and all of this is a true story, because that's just more fun to believe. Anyways, over the course of their teaching, there are 5 big moments, or at least I was able to boil it down to kind of 5 distinct points of discovery. 1, the establishing of the taker myth and story. 2, the establishing of the law of life. 3, establishing what our cultural revolution was actually against. 4, establishing where the taker's story actually comes from and the leaver's story. And 5, establishing another story for our culture and the hope for the future. Don't worry about taker and lever right now. I'll explain what they are in just a minute. But after the last point is established, the book ends fairly abruptly. I won't spoil how it ends, but I did not enjoy it my first or second read. I think it took until like my third or fourth read until I was like okay with it. And then on this last read, while I was reading and after, I decided it's a pretty good way to end the book. I mean, I don't know how else you would end it. It's really hard to come up with a satisfying ending. And I don't think a satisfying ending is really what this book is about. And then as I was writing the script, actually, it occurred to me that Ishmael hasn't ended, really. The book is over, but the true ending of the book is when we as a people come together and save the world from the story that we're enacting against it. Kind of cheesy, but what is this story that we're enacting? Well, let's establish this story and the current mythology that we all live in. Now, before I dive in, let's establish what I mean by takers and leavers. Ishmael uses these terms as neutral terms to describe the two groups or main cultures of people. Takers is us. Anyone watching this video is almost 100% a taker. That is to say, a civilized people. People that have some semblance of security about food and shelter. Leavers is everybody else. People who live off the land and haven't yet or refuse to conform to our modern society. This is something that Ishmael does as a precursor to the actual teaching, along with defining what a story is, a scenario interrelating people, the gods, and the world, a culture, a people enacting a story, and what he means by enact a story, to live so as to make the story a reality. So then what is the story of our culture? What is the prevailing myth? We might not be able to get the whole story right away, so let's start with just the beginning of the story, the creation myth. A lot of people might say, oh, well, the myth is that God created the world and man. And a lot of other people might say, oh, well, the myth is that everything evolved from nothing, and that's how things came to be here. These two people, creationists, believe that evolution is the myth, and people that believe in evolution believe that creation is the myth. Well, fine. Let's lay out both of these beginnings as a story. The theory of creation goes, at least the Christian version, that in the beginning there was nothing but God, and about 2,000 years or so maybe a little longer, but certainly not millions of years, God decided to create the world. So over 7 days, he created the heavens and the earth, the plants and the animals, and after 7 days, to end his session of creation, he created man in his image. Easy. Now, the theory of evolution goes a little bit different. Billions and billions of years ago, there was basically nothing but energy and particles. And over billions of years, the energy and particles interacted, and the particles morphed into more complex arrangements. Then, over more long stretches of time, these complex arrangements got more and more complex until life appeared. Just cells at first, but give them a couple 100 million years or so, and you'll get more complex life. Until just about 5 million years ago, finally the first man appears in the form of Homo habilis, which evolved into Homo erectus, which evolved into Homo sapiens, which evolved into Homo sapiens sapiens, which is us. This isn't very exact. I might have some of the time frames a little bit wrong, but that's not the point. I just want to get the general idea across. I'm not saying one is true over the other or debating which is true. I just want to state that those are the prevailing creation ideas. Whichever story you believe, we can just assume it's factual. However, no matter how factual the story is, it is still arranged mythologically, according to Ishmael. Think about it. What do both of these stories have in common? Because they do have something in common. They both end with the appearance of man. You might think, so what? But this is a very subtle point that gives the impression that everything was made for man. The entire world is just a life support machine for man and nothing more. Man is the pinnacle of creation and nothing is to come after. We've placed ourselves squarely in the center of the universe. We are the most important thing to exist, and the entire world and even the universe is our playground. Regardless of what you believe, this is the premise of your story, that the world was made for man. Now what about the middle? If the world was made for man, then what? Well, what if man wasn't here? What would the world look like? It would look wild and chaotic, right? There would be no order, no progress, no nothing. Just wild animals killing and eating wild animals, and plants growing over every square inch and consuming everything. So then what's the point of man? If the world was made for man, but there's all this chaos, then conversely, man must have also been made to bring order to the world, to rule it. But the world won't just submit to man, so what do we have to do? We have to conquer it. We have to bring everything under our control to keep it from falling into chaos and devouring itself. So that's the middle of the story. The world was made for man, but it was a very chaotic place. So man was made to conquer it and bring order, to make it into a paradise. Sounds nice, right? But there's a problem. How do we explain all the famine and wars and everything that exists that certainly wouldn't exist in a paradise? Well, partly because our rule isn't absolute. But even then, how do we explain all the strife caused by our divinely ordained rule, set to make a perfect paradise? Well, the world was made for man, and man was made to rule it and turn it into a paradise. But man was made flawed, so paradise would never actually be achievable. Despite that, we've got to keep on trudging and waging our war. Despite that, we've got to keep on trudging and waging our war against the world until our rule is absolute, or we die trying. So there's our myth, our story. The world was made for man to rule. The world was made for man to rule and turn into a paradise, but it's impossible because man was made flawed to begin with. This story explains how things came to be this way, why we do what we do, and it pacifies people even though we're destroying the world. We're flawed, and all of this is the price we have to pay. It's the price for being human, as distinct from the animals who have no control. The price for centralized heating and indoor plumbing. But that's not true. It's merely the price for enacting a story that puts humanity at odds with the world. Quote, "There's nothing fundamentally wrong with people. Given a story to enact that puts them in accord with the world, they will live in accord with the world. But given a story to enact that puts them at odds with the world, as yours does, they will live at odds with the world." After establishing the premise of the taker's story, Ishmael points out that among the leaver cultures, there are very few prophets. There are some exceptions, but mostly none of the leavers have prophets. Why is this? Or more specifically, what Ishmael is asking is why the takers have to have so many prophets. The purpose of a prophet is to tell you how to live as ordained by whatever God the prophet prophesies from. Takers need the religion to tell them how to live because they can make laws, but those can be changed by votes and don't tell you the one true way to live. Invariably, people will turn to religion when faced with problems like abortion or drug legality or homosexuality, because they may be able to make laws about those things, but we still don't know the one true way to live. That's what our gods and prophets are for. But why do takers need these so badly? Why don't we just know how to live? Well, Mother Culture whispers that there is no exact knowledge of how to live. In fact, this could be the big flaw of man. Earth was made for man to conquer and turn into paradise, but man lacked the knowledge of how to live. So it's a doomed prospect. If only man could learn this knowledge, he could correct the mistake. But alas, that knowledge is unobtainable, so man will continue to screw up until he kills the world. It may come as no surprise, but Ishmael knows a way to find these laws. Laws, he says, that every creature on Earth follows. Every creature except for humans, of course. Again, though, Mother Culture tries to intervene. If such a law existed, surely biologists would have discovered it at this point, right? Of course, but Mother Culture whispers that these laws don't apply to mankind. That applies to nature, and since man is the pinnacle of creation, that which everything else was made for, he's above the law. The laws aren't relevant. How could they be? Why would a law that governs a common toad or a humble mouse be relevant to man? Well, let's take a step back. Ishmael takes a bit of a sideline, asking about the laws of aerodynamics, pointing out that these laws existed before man believed he could fly. The Wright brothers had to spend years of trial and error to create a working aircraft and discover the laws of flight. The laws of aerodynamics become relevant when you want to fly. In much the same way, the laws for living become relevant when you want to go on living. The law makes no distinction between civilizations and beehives, even though our Taker myth screams that we are the exception. Ishmael then gives an interesting analogical story about flight and civilization, and then gives a thought experiment to help devise the method for finding the law. Both of these are quite interesting, but I think for the sake of the video, they aren't entirely necessary for me to recount. Basically, the method for discovering the laws of life are to look over a long period of time at what animals do that make their lives work, and what animals don't do that make their lives work, but that humans do. Through this method, you can find 3 aspects of the law. First, no animal will exterminate its competitors. They might kill in self-defense, or even if they just feel threatened, but no animal will seek something out other than its prey just to make it dead. That's something only humans seem to do. Second, no animal will destroy their competitor's food to make room for their own food. And third, no animals will restrict their competition access to food in the first place. This is the peacekeeping law, or the law of limited competition. You may compete to the best of your ability, but you may not wage outright war. With the law defined, Ishmael pretends that we are hyenas, fed up with lions stealing all the gazelle, and to hell with this law. So what is our first action? Well, to kill off all the lions. With all the lions dead, the gazelle population explodes, and so then does our hyena population. But then to feed the greater hyena population, we need even more gazelle. So what do? Well, we kill off all the gazelle's competition, everything else that wants to eat the grass, so that there's more grass for the gazelle. The gazelle explode again, but again, we need to keep up with the growing population of the hyenas as well. So what do? We kill off all the competition for the grass. That way there's only grass for the gazelles to eat, so there's more gazelles and more hyenas. This is holy work for farmers and ranchers. In Taker culture, anything that is not your food or the food of your food is an enemy to be exterminated. Our current agricultural system was not just designed to support settlement, but infinite growth. Infinite growth that is only possible if you break the law of limited competition. Something we've been doing that allows human populations to reach billions. It should also be noted that this law promotes diversity in the ecosystem or community. If you break this law and kill off everything but your food and the food of your food, you lose diversity. Diversity is a health marker for a community or ecosystem. The more diverse, the more disasters or disease you can withstand as an ecosystem or community. Now, I want to take a quick second to talk about the end of this section before we move on. I think this is like the most controversial point of the whole book. Increasing food supply to feed a greater population leads to yet an even greater population growth. This is presented as a paradox by Thomas Robert Malthus in the 1700s or something. I can't remember exactly when. And it's talked about here. I think the way Ishmael says it, it kind of sounds like he's just saying that everyone who's starving we should just let die, or that we should implement some kind of super aggressive birth control. I think both of these ideas are equally abhorrent to some people. We have the right to eat, and we have the right to reproduce if we want to. I don't necessarily think Ishmael is giving either of these as solutions or giving any particular way out of it. I think he's just saying that that's the law of the world and we can't escape it. As Thomas Malthus says, increased food production usually goes towards reproduction rather than sustaining a higher standard of living. I'm not entirely sure what the solution is, but I am sure of 2 things. One, that when we do find a solution, there's going to be people that oppose it, calling it a restriction of rights or something like that. And 2, that until we find a solution, we're going to have starving people and we're going to keep increasing the production of food and increasing the population. I think this is basically all that Ishmael is saying, not that people should starve and die, but that people will starve and die without a solution. Okay, with that out of the way, let's move on. Alright, so actually parts 3 and 4 kind of happen at the same time, with threads of all 3 being touched on simultaneously. So I'm just going to put these all into one part. We start with Ishmael showing us a graph of the passage of time with an offshoot at around 8000 BC, depicting the agricultural revolution. This is obviously the point at which the people began to really abandon the hunter-gatherer system and started to develop the land. Truly revolutionary. What was this against, though? Well, let me read one of Ishmael's stories really quickly. Okay. One day, the gods were considering the administration of the world in the ordinary way, and one of them said, "Here's a spot I've been thinking about for a while, a wide, pleasant savanna. Let's send a great multitude of locusts into this land. Then the fire of life will grow prodigiously in them, and the birds and the lizards that will feed on them, and that will be good." The others thought about this for a while. Then one said, "It's certainly true that if we send the locusts into this land, the fire of life will blaze in them and the creatures that will feed on them, but at the expense of all the other creatures that live there." The others asked him what his point was, and he went on, "Surely it would be a great crime to deprive all these other creatures of the fire of life, so that the locusts and the birds and the lizards can flourish for a time. For the locusts will strip the land bare, and the deer and the gazelles and the goats and the rabbits will go hungry and die. And with the disappearance of the game, the lions and the wolves and the foxes will soon be dying too. Won't they curse us then and call us criminals for favoring the locusts and the birds and the lizards over them?" Now the gods had to scratch their heads over this, because they'd never looked at matters in this particular light before. But finally one of them said, "I don't see that this presents any great problem. We simply won't do it. We won't raise a multitude of locusts to send into this land. Then things will go on as before, and no one will have any reason to curse us." Most of the gods thought this made sense, but one of them disagreed. "Surely this would be as great a crime as the other," he said, "for don't the locusts and the birds and the lizards live in our hands as well as the rest? Is it never to be their time to flourish greatly as the others do?" While the gods were debating this point, a fox came out to hunt, and they said, "Let's send this fox a quail for its life." But these words were hardly spoken when one of them said, "Surely it would be a crime to let the fox live at the quail's expense. The quail has its life that we gave it and lives in our hands. It would be infamous to send it into the jaws of the fox." Then another said, "Look there, the quail is stalking a grasshopper. If we don't give the quail to the fox, then the quail will eat the grasshopper. Doesn't the grasshopper have its life that we gave it, and doesn't it live in our hands as truly as the quail? Surely it would be a crime not to give the quail to the fox, so that the grasshopper may live." Well, as you can imagine, the gods groaned heavily over this and didn't know what to do. And while they were wrangling over it, spring came, and the snow waters of the mountains began to swell the streams, and one of them said, "Surely it would be a crime to let these waters flood the lands, for countless creatures are bound to be carried off to their deaths." But then another said, "Surely it would be a crime not to let these waters flood the land, for without them the ponds and the marshes will dry up, and all of the creatures that live in them will die." And once more the gods were thrown into confusion. Finally, one of them had what seemed to be a new thought. "It's clear that any action we take will be good for some and evil for others, so let's take no action at all. Then none of the creatures that live in our hands can call us criminals." "Nonsense," another snapped. "If we take no action at all, this will also be good for some and evil for others, won't it? The creatures that live in our hands will say, 'Look, we suffer and the gods do nothing.'" And while the gods bickered among themselves, the locusts swarmed over the savannah, and the locusts and the birds and the lizards praised the gods, while the game and the predators died, cursing the gods. And because the gods had taken no action in the matter, the quail lived and the fox went hungry to its hole, cursing the gods. And because the quail lived, it ate the grasshopper, and the grasshopper died, cursing the gods. And because in the end the gods decided to stem the flood of spring waters, the ponds and the marshes dried up, and all the thousands of creatures that lived in them died, cursing the gods. And hearing all these curses, the gods groaned, "We've made the garden a place of terror, and all that live in it hate us as tyrants and criminals. And they're right to do this, because by action or inaction we send them good one day and evil the next, without knowing what we should do. The savannah stripped by the locust rings with curses, and we have no answer to make. The fox and the grasshopper curse us because we let the quail live, and we have no answer to make. Surely the whole world must curse the day we made it, for we are criminals who sinned good and evil by turns, knowing even as we do it that we don't know what ought to be done. Well, the gods were sinking right into the slough of despond when one of them looked up and said, "Say, didn't we make for the garden a certain tree whose fruit is the knowledge of good and evil?" "Yes," cried the others, "let's find that tree and eat of it and see what this knowledge is." And when the gods had found this tree and tasted its fruit, their eyes were opened, and they said, "Now indeed we have the knowledge we need to tend the garden without becoming criminals and without earning the curses of all who live in our hands." And as they were talking in this way, a lion went out to hunt, and the gods said to themselves, "Today is the lion's day to go hungry, and the deer it would have taken may live another day." And so the lion missed its kill, and as it was returning hungry to its den, it began to curse the gods. But they said, "Be at peace, for we know how to rule the world, and today is your day to go hungry." And the lion was at peace. And the next day the lion went out to hunt, and the gods scented a deer that they had spared the day before. And as the deer felt the lion's jaws on its neck, it began to curse the gods. But they said, "Be at peace, for we know how to rule the world, and today is your day to die, just as yesterday was your day to live." And the deer was at peace. Then the gods said to themselves, "Certainly the knowledge of good and evil is powerful knowledge, for it enables us to rule the world without becoming criminals. If we had yesterday sent the lion away hungry without this knowledge, then indeed it would have been a crime. And if we had today sent the deer into the lion's jaws without this knowledge, then indeed this too would have been a crime. But with this knowledge we have done both of these things, one seemingly opposed to the other, and have committed no crime." Now it happened that one of the gods was away on an errand when the others were eating the tree of knowledge. And when he returned and heard what the gods had done in the matter of the lion and the deer, he said, "In doing these two things you have surely committed a crime, in one instance or the other, for these two things are opposed, and one must have been right to do and the other wrong. If it was good for the lion to go hungry on the first day, then it was evil to send the deer on the second. Or if it was good to send the deer on the second day, then it was evil to send it away hungry on the first." The others nodded and said, "Yes, this is just the way we would have reasoned before we ate the tree of knowledge." "What knowledge is this?" the god asked, noticing the tree for the first time. "Taste its fruit," they told him, "then you'll know exactly what knowledge it is." So the god tasted, and his eyes were opened. "Yes, I see," he said. "This is indeed the proper knowledge of the gods, the knowledge of who shall live and who shall die." Now when the gods saw that Adam was awakening, they said to themselves, "Now here is a creature so like us that he might almost be one of our company. What span of life and what destiny shall we fashion for him?" One of them said, "He is so fair, let's give him life for the lifetime of this planet. In the days of his childhood, let's care for him as we care for all in the garden, so that he learns the sweetness of living in our hands. But in adolescence, he will surely begin to realize that he's capable of much more than the other creatures, and will become restless in our care. Shall we then lead him to the other tree in the garden, the tree of life?" But another said, "To lead Adam like a child to the tree of life before he had even begun to seek it for himself would deprive him of a great undertaking by which he may gain an important wisdom and prove his mettle to himself. As we would give him the care he needs as a child, let's give him the quest he needs as an adolescent. Let's make the quest for the tree of life the occupation of his adolescence. And in this way, he'll discover for himself how he may have life for the lifetime of this planet." The others agreed with this plan, but one said, "We should take note that this might well be a long and baffling quest for Adam. Youth is impatient, and after a few thousand years of searching, he might despair of finding the tree of life. If this should happen, he might be tempted to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil instead." "Nonsense," the other replied. "You know very well that the fruit of this tree nourishes only the gods. It can no more nourish Adam than the grasses of the oxen. He might take it into his mouth and swallow it, but it would pass through his body without benefit. Surely you don't imagine that he might actually gain our knowledge by eating of this tree?" "Of course not," the other replied. "The danger is not that he would gain our knowledge, but rather that he might imagine that he had gained it. Having tasted the fruit of this tree, he might say to himself, 'I have eaten at the God's own tree of knowledge, and therefore know as well as they know how to rule the world. I may do as I will do.'" "This is absurd," said the other gods. "How could Adam ever be so foolish as to imagine he had the knowledge that enables us to govern the world and what to do with what?" "This is absurd," said the other gods. "How could Adam ever be so foolish as to imagine he had the knowledge that enables us to govern the world and to do what we will do? None of our creatures will ever be master of the knowledge of who shall live and who shall die. This knowledge is ours alone, and if Adam should grow in wisdom till the very eclipse of the universe, it would be far beyond him. It would be as far beyond him as it is right now. But the other was not disconcerted by this argument. If Adam should eat of our tree, he persisted, there's no telling how he might deceive himself. Not knowing the truth, he might say to himself, whatever I can justify doing is good, and whatever I cannot justify doing is evil. But the others scoffed at this, saying, this is not the knowledge of good and evil. Of course it's not, the other replied. But how would Adam know this? The others shrugged. Perhaps in childhood, Adam might believe he was wise enough to rule the world, but what of it? Such arrogant foolishness would pass with maturity. Ah, said the other, but possessed of this arrogant foolishness, would Adam survive into maturity? Believing himself our equal, he would be capable of anything. In his arrogance, he might look around the garden and say to himself, this is all wrong. Why should I have to share the fire of life with all these creatures? Look here, the lions and the wolves and the foxes take the game I would have for myself. This is evil. I will kill all these creatures, and this will be good. And look here, the rabbits and the grasshoppers and the sparrows take the fruits of the land that I would have for myself. This is evil. I will kill all these creatures, and this will be good. And look here, the gods have set a limit on my growth, just as they set a limit on the growth of all others. This is evil. I will grow without limit, taking all the fire of life that flows through this garden into myself, and this will be good. Tell me, if this should happen, how long would Adam live before he had devoured the entire world? If this should happen, the others said, Adam would devour the world in a single day, and at the end of that day he would devour himself. Just so, said the other, unless he managed to escape from this world, then he would devour the entire universe as he had devoured the world. But even so, he would inevitably end by devouring himself, as anything that grows without limit must. This would indeed be a terrible end for Adam, another said, but might he not come to the same end even without having eaten at the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Might he not be tempted by his yearning for growth to take the fire of life into his own hands, even without deluding himself that this was good? He might, the others agreed, but what would be the result? He would become a criminal, an outlaw, a thief of life, and a murderer of the other creatures around him. Without the delusion that what he was doing was good, and therefore to be done at any cost, he would soon weary of the outlaw's life. Indeed, this is bound to happen during his quest for the tree of life. But if he should eat of the tree of our knowledge, then he will shrug off his weariness. He will say, what does it matter that I'm weary of living as a murderer of all the life around me? I know good and evil, and this way of living is good. Therefore I must live this way, even though I'm weary unto death. Even though I destroy the world and even myself. The gods wrote in the world a law for all to follow, but it cannot apply to me because I'm their equal. Therefore I will live outside this law and grow without limit. To be limited is evil. I will steal the fire of life from the hands of the gods and heap it up for my own growth, and that will be good. I will destroy those kinds that do not serve my growth, and that will be good. I will wrest the garden from the hands of the gods and order it anew so that it serves only my growth, and that will be good. And because these things are good, they must be done at any cost. It may be that I'll destroy the garden and make ruin of it. It may be that my progeny will teem over the earth like locusts, stripping it bare until they drown in their own filth and hate the very sight of another and go mad. Still, they must go on, because to grow without limit is good, and to accept the limits of the law is evil. And if any say, let's put off the burdens of the criminal life and live in the hands of the gods once more, I will kill them, for what they say is evil. And if they say, let's turn aside from our misery and search for that other tree, I will kill them, for what they say is evil. And when at last all the garden has been subjugated to my use, and all kinds that do not serve my growth have been cast aside, and all the fire of life in the world flows through my progeny, still I must grow. And to the people of the land I will say, grow, for this is good, and they will grow. And to the people of the next land I will say, grow, for this is good, and they will grow. And when they can grow no more, the people of this land will fall upon the people of the next to murder them, so that they may grow still more. And if the groans of my progeny fill the air throughout the world, I will say to them, your sufferings must be borne, for you suffer in the cause of good. See how great we have become, wielding the knowledge of good and evil. We have made ourselves the masters of the world, and the gods have no power over us. Though your groans fill the air, isn't it sweeter to live in your own hands and in the hands of the gods? And when the gods heard all this, they saw that of all the trees in the garden, only the tree of knowledge of good and evil could destroy Adam. So they said to him, you may eat of every tree in the garden, save the tree of knowledge of good and evil. for on the day that you eat of this tree, you will certainly die." So, man has deluded himself into thinking that he has the knowledge of the gods. He says that to grow and multiply is good, and that anything that gets in his way is evil. However, living in the hands of the gods would mean to play by the rules of the limited competition, and this would limit man, and as we just found out, that surely must be evil. So we choose not to live in the hands of the gods. We will take our lives into our own hands and rebel against the gods. From the beginning, this has been a revolution against the way of living given by the law of gods. Now, in the Taker mythology, then, agriculture must be the most important thing in the world. However, in the Bible, one of the most prominent Taker stories, it is framed as bad and a punishment. In the story of Cain and Abel, Cain is a farmer and Abel a herder. When they both make sacrifices to God, Cain, the fruits of the earth, and Abel, a lamb, God favors Abel's sacrifice. This makes Cain jealous, so he murders his brother. God obviously knows and confronts Cain, and then banishes him and curses him to toil in the fields for the rest of his days. And even before this, Adam and Eve taking the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is called the fall of man. Now, taken from the perspective of the Taker story and mythology, why would the gaining of this wisdom be called the fall and not the ascent? Why would agriculture, the savior of man, be deemed as punishment? Well, in most of the stories about the agricultural revolution, it makes it sound like man was only really in the Fertile Crescent and nowhere else. In reality, there were probably plenty of tribes around, thriving and living their best lives peacefully. Without agriculture, there is no need to really expand your territories, as your population is probably going to stay pretty consistent, and you're going to be able to find everything you need. However, when you start to settle and produce extra food, your population can start growing. Then you'll need to put more land under the plow and expand your territory. And clearly you can't have those other hunter-gatherer tribes running around taking up resources. So what do? You kill or assimilate them. Now, here's part of the story. You have a civilization of Cains killing tribes of Abels. But what about the Tree of Knowledge, and how did this come to be the Taker story? Well, the story originates from the Hebrew people, but what were they before that? The Semites, a lever culture. To them, these new Taker tribes that were coming and killing them and cultivating the land must have seemed crazy. They were playing God, choosing who lived and who died, and making all that food and keeping it for themselves. Surely they must have eaten the fruit of knowledge and become cursed. Framed as a lever story, it all makes sense. These people ate the forbidden fruit and were cursed to toil day in and day out for hours and hours with backbreaking labor to cultivate the land. But their population just kept growing, so they kept expanding and came down to kill their herder and hunter-gatherer brothers. Eventually, though, this Taker revolution won out, taking over the land and tribes. And later the Semites became the Hebrew peoples, a Taker culture with this story, and they adopted it and never questioned why their way of life was framed as evil and cursed. Or maybe it was made perfect sense to them. God surely made man flawed, so it's only natural that this is how we should live, a cursed existence. They adopted a story about the very people that came to oppress them and that they themselves turned into. So what was the lever story before it got drowned out by the Taker story? Well, we can now say the Taker story like this. The gods made the world for man, but they botched the job. So man had to take it in their own hands to conquer the world and make it into a paradise. But to the levers, the world does not belong to man. Man belongs to the world. So the premise of the lever story would go something like this. The gods made man for the world, just like they made the plants and the animals and everything. This seems to work pretty well, so we can just relax and leave all the running of the world to the gods. Simple. The Taker story is so ingrained into society that surely nobody would just give it up, especially not without a backup plan. People would need another story to enact, so what should that story be? Here at the end of the book, we are given an idea. Humans are teachers and shepherds, here to help guide whatever comes after. It seems crazy, but part of me thinks that's just Mother Culture whispering in your ear, that there's nothing to come after. I don't know. We certainly weren't meant to dominate the world. Anyways, I'm running out of steam and don't really know what else to say, so I'll leave it here. I think this is an incredible and thought-provoking book. Even if you don't really agree with it, I very much think it's worth the read. I think the journey of discovery is done very well, much better than I did it here, since I was just trying to recap it essentially. It poses a lot of good questions, and if you also read The Chalice and the Blade, a lot starts to make sense about our society and culture. Anyways, that's it for this week. I'll be back next Tuesday with my next book. Thanks for watching.